Hi everyone and welcome. So last week I made a video about my favorite books that I read in 2020, and if you missed it and you think that it's interesting for you, I'll link that down below. But of course I read a lot of other books as well that year. Some of them were surprising, good or bad. I had some disappointing reads, I even had one DNF. And instead of making a lot of different videos about those different topics, I decided to just make one video, this video, and talk about all of them in one go in a chronological order, so starting from the series or standalones that I read in January 2020 until December 2020. And just give you my thoughts about whether or not I'm going to continue this series if I haven't finished it yet, if I think it's something that I would recommend to other people, or if it just really fell a little bit flat. So without further ado, let's just start with the first series, the one that I started in January 2020. And that series is The Grim Company by Luke Scull. This is his debut trilogy that's grimdark fantasy and is often compared to the work of Joe Abercrombie. I haven't read Abercrombie's books yet, that's on my TBR for 2020, so I do not know if this comparison holds true, but this was a very enjoyable trilogy. I read it in its completion in 2020, and even though the ending was a little bit iffy in my opinion, I still would recommend this to grimdark fantasy fans who have read the most known names out there and want to try something different. I think this one is a good way to go. I enjoyed the second book most of all because, among other characters, you follow a warrior brute in this fantasy trilogy. And in the first book you do not know a lot about him, which makes him not really likable. But in the second one you get to know a lot of his past, which makes his story arc or character arc actually the most enjoyable, even though he's just a side character. In the third book I had some complaints because it felt like the author had a lot of open threads and he didn't really know how to close them up nicely. So there are definitely some unanswered questions, and I had the feeling that he might wanted to expand this world more, maybe with a second trilogy, but I haven't heard anything about that, so I don't know if maybe that's a problem with publishing or if I just really misread the ending. Then the second series that I read in 2020 was immediately my biggest disappointment of the year. It was the series that I enjoyed least of all, and that is Mistborn II by Brandon Sanderson, the first one being The Alloy of Law. This is going to be a quartet. At the moment 3 books are out. I read all 3 and I really didn't enjoy them. Now I do know that Mistborn Era 1 was completely different from this one. I loved Mistborn Era 1 and people had warned me before that yes, this one is going to be less epic, it's going to be smaller in scale, and it's just going to be completely different because this is Western based and I don't enjoy Westerns at all. So that's more a problem that I had and not a problem that's due to the book. But still, the characters, for instance, I really didn't enjoy. You have the main character, Wax, who is a cardboard. There is zero personality to be found there. And then you have his best friend, Wayne, who's constantly trying to be funny to a degree that that's not how real people are. That's just stereotypical and obnoxious. You have a female main character that I didn't really like. She tried to impress Wax too much, up to a point that I just found it annoying. And basically the only character in here that has some character growth is Steris. If you've read this, Steris being the one with the most character growth tells you a lot about what I think about the other characters. I just couldn't find anything here that I enjoyed a little bit, even though I must say that I understand that the series has some merits. For example, the magic system here is basically evolved from the first Mistborn series, so Mistborn Era 1, where you have some very interesting tweaks here. Also, the world has evolved, where Mistborn Era 1 is more medieval inspired, this one is Western inspired. That's something that you don't really see a lot in fantasy novels, where you really have a clear evolution, where industrialization is happening, for instance. So yes, I do give credit for that, but that wasn't enough to keep me hooked for 3, soon to be 4 books in a row. Then next up I started the Wheel of Time series by Robert Jordan, the first one being The Eye of the World, and by now I read the first 4 books and I am going to continue with the series, but I'm going to take it quite slowly because even though I enjoyed the first 4 books, there are just some small details that make me not love it as much as some other series and make it probably not going to be a favorite series of all time. This is definitely classical fantasy, so if you like stuff like Lord of the Rings, for example, I do think that this will be up your alley. Like most classical fantasy, the magic system here isn't completely explained, it's definitely soft magic, or at least it is in the first 4 books, but I do think that this will stay the same for the rest of the series. So basically this takes the trope of the chosen one, but it does do some cool stuff with it, and there's a lot in these books. Of course, this is a series of 14 books in total, and then you have one prequel, so in total actually 15 books. So it's going to be very detailed. There's going to be a lot of characters, a lot of complex world building, etc. And it was even a little bit too much for me. I do not mind a complex story, but only if it's necessary. And here I felt like some things could have been trimmed. There could have been a little bit less characters mentioned, a little bit less complex world building. For instance, if it would have been 10 books instead of 14, I do think that maybe I would have liked it better. But again, that's not a fault of the story or of the books, that's more my personal preference. I did also have some problems with character interaction here, especially male versus female communication, where that was a little bit annoying how they interacted with each other and how females treated males sometimes. But this wasn't too annoying that it kept me from enjoying the story. In the fourth book, I liked the character arcs most. I really enjoy Parent's character arc, for instance, in that book, so that really got me interested in at least picking up the fifth book and seeing how that progresses. And we do have some snippets in the first 4 books that tells us that the character arc of Rand is going to be very spectacular and interesting to see what happens there. It might have another twist. Then next up, I read another Brandon Sanderson story, Warbreaker. I love this. I made my top 10 list so that I had 1 book per author, but if that wasn't the case, then Warbreaker would definitely been on there. This is a story that Brandon Sanderson wants to expand with some sequels, but this one has a very clear ending, so you can definitely read it as a standalone. In this world, you follow Ciri. Ciri's sister is supposed to be married off to the God King, but at the very last moment, her father decides to send Ciri off instead. So that's basically how this story begins, very fast-paced with a lot of action even in the beginning. Now Vivenna, the sister that should have been married to the God King, feels sorry for Ciri and goes after her in secret to save her from this God King. The magic system here was very interesting. It's Sanderson's strong suit, so you do expect to have a good magic system in here, and that was definitely the case. It's a hard magic system, but it is a little bit softer than the one that you have in Mistborn Era 1, which I do think is a good thing, because sometimes if the magic system is too hard, it also starts to become more scientific and it takes a little bit of the magic out of it. Here I think it had just the right amount of hard versus soft inside the magic system that is color based and really interesting. So I do think that this is something that you might enjoy if you like to have some interesting magic systems in your story. There were a lot of plot twists in this book. It was very fast paced. You follow a lot of interesting characters in my opinion, which is why I would also recommend this to somebody who's new to adult fantasy. And yeah, I would definitely recommend this to everyone who is already a fan of Brandon Sanderson or wants to start reading his work. This is a good place to start. So next up, I read another book by Brandon Sanderson, and that one is Elantris. This is also going to be a series, but at this point it's still a standalone, with a definitely very clear ending, so you can read this as a standalone for sure. Most people think that this is Brandon Sanderson's weakest entry in the Cosmere, and even though I don't agree, I can definitely see why some people think this. So in this book you follow Serene, who is also going to be married off to a crown prince. In this world you have Elantris, which was basically the city of the gods. And as a normal person, you could go to sleep, have the blessing of the chaos upon you, and then you would wake up as a demigod who could get to live in Elantris, which was some kind of magical city, and you would also have magical powers. However, 10 years ago something happened, and the chaos was now not a blessing but more of a curse. Elantris, also being the city where the chaos was come upon, would go, but now not as some magical city, but more as a prison for these people. Now, this crown prince that Serene is supposed to marry is being cursed by this chaos as well, which is unbeknownst to her. So she goes now to the city more as a widow, because she thinks that he just died off. And the story begins from here. Now, the reason why I think that most people don't really enjoy this is because it's definitely a slow start. One of the plots here is that the Elantrians used to have magic, but now they don't know how this magic works. So for a big part of the book, you don't have a magic system, or at least a magic system that doesn't work and that isn't really focused upon. Because some people, and I won't go into details who these people are because that would be a little bit spoilery, are trying to find out how this magic works. And the magic starts working towards the end. So if you're a big fan of magic systems, yes, I can definitely see that that is a big minus for this story. However, some of the characters were very interesting to follow. There was a priest in this book that I really liked a lot. So as long as you know that this is a slower read and that the magic systems that Brandon Sanderson is very well known of are a little bit less present here, I do think that you can still very much enjoy this book. Next up, I started a series by one of my favorite authors, and that was the Liveship Traders trilogy by Robin Hobb. This is the second trilogy in her Realm of the Elderling series, the first one being the Farseer series. And this first one, Ship of Magic, I was a little bit disappointed by, because after I read the Farseer trilogy, a lot of people said you're going to love the Liveship Traders trilogy even more. A lot of people think that this is their favorite trilogy of the whole Realm of the Elderling series, and I found that the first one kind of fell a little bit flat. This is a multiple POV story, so very different than Farseer, and it's a lot wider, a lot bigger, because most of the characters that you follow are on different parts of the world. The plot lines are not intertwined in the beginning, so you have different plot lines that you need to follow, and that's why it's very difficult to get into in the beginning. And it feels a little bit slow, because you're not invested in the characters, you're not invested in the story yet. And it takes almost 3/4 of the book, for me at least, to feel a little bit invested. And after that it really picked up. The second book, The Mad Ship, was very good. I really loved it. That's one of my favorites of 2020. But the first one I think could have been handled a little bit better. I haven't read the third one yet, but I am very looking forward to it, because I do think that this is very interesting. In the first one you follow the family Vestrid, which are Liveship Traders, and their live ship Vivacia that has just been brought to life. And on the other hand you follow Captain Kenneth, who is a pirate, and his quest to become king of the pirates. So in the beginning these two storylines are very separate, and then towards the progression of the first book they do get closer together, and you also have some side storylines that are being introduced in the first and also a little bit in the second book. So I am very interested to read further into this series and see if in the end I do really like it more than the Farseer trilogy, as what most people expected, but I don't really think so. I think that the Farseer trilogy by her will still be my favorite of the two. The next books that I read are a little bit lesser known, I think, and that is the Enchanter General trilogy by Dave Duncan. So I read the first two, which is Ironfoot, and then the second one, Trial by Treason. As you can see, these are very short books. I think both are around 300, maybe 280 pages, so very quick reads. These are historical fantasy, and it's a little bit murder mystery. So think of Sherlock Holmes if Sherlock Holmes was set in ancient England. So in this story you follow Duncan. Duncan is a Saxon boy who wants to become a sage in a country where Norsemen are currently the ruling class. So he is studying to become a sage and use enchantment as his primary form of magic, when he comes upon an ancient spell that isn't working, but he is able to correct this spell, and by using the spell predict murder. Now when then the message comes a couple of days later that a sage of a neighboring castle has been murdered, he is set upon a quest to find out who the murderer is in order to prevent worse. So this is really the mystery that you follow. The magic system is very soft magic, which almost felt a little bit too soft in my opinion, especially because it's the only magical element that is in here. These books are very fast paced, and I actually quite enjoy them. They're not the best reads that I've ever had. I've read the first two. So in the first one you have this mystery, in the second one you have kind of like similar type of mystery, and I really enjoyed following Derwin, Duncan is the writer, and how he uses his skills in a country where he is basically seen as a lesser man, being a Saxon boy, in order to predict murder and to find out who the killer is. I had a little bit of problems with the romance in these books, both the first but especially the second one, but it's only a very minor part of the story, so it didn't really trouble me that much. Next up, I picked up another standalone fantasy, and that was Uprooted by Naomi Novik. This is another one of her fairy tale retellings, Spinning Silver being the other one that I've read and really enjoyed. But unlike that one, I had some issues with Uprooted, even though in the end I did like it and would recommend this if you like fairy tale retellings. So in this story, you have the retelling of Beauty and the Beast, but it's really a very thin layer of this fairy tale. It's a lot more that's going on in this book. You also have a magical forest that is a very big theme throughout the book from the beginning until the ending. Now, this book for me had some pacing issues, and it also felt like this was a little bit in between. So either you keep the original fairy tale and stay very close to that one with not that much side storylines, or you expand it, but then you should expand it completely. This one was a little bit too much to just be a simple fairy tale retelling, but it was not enough to be something completely different. I would have liked if she really had these sidelines to have a duology, or just maybe 100 pages more to explain this, or cut some of this and have 100 pages less, but not this in-between state. The magical forest I did really like, and I think that that's definitely one of the strong suits of this story, but the main character, I thought she was a little bit cliche, to be honest. I liked the main character in Spinning Silver. That was a very strong female character. This one, yeah, very cliche. She's clumsy, which is something that you read a lot, the clumsy girl, but all of a sudden she's very powerful. Yeah, I've seen it before and I don't really like it that much. And also the romance in this book, even though it's only like 10% of the book, so it's not a big deal, but I didn't really enjoy this romance. And then the last book that I completed in 2020 that wasn't on my top 10 list was by one of my favorite authors as well, and that is Woolskin by Juliette Merlier. This is the first book in a duology, the second one being Fox Mask, but I still need to read that one. I highly enjoyed this book. Again, I had that rule of one book per author in my top 10 list, otherwise Woolskin would have definitely been on there. So in this book you follow Eyvind. Eyvind is a Viking boy and he wants to grow up and become a wolfskin, which is a warrior of Thor. When he is a boy, he meets Summerlad, who is also a boy, but he's a little bit strange. He's not strong, he's more of a scholar type. And Eyvind feels a little bit sorry for him, so he becomes friends with Summerlad and even becomes sworn blood brothers. When he grows up, he becomes a wolfskin, and one day he goes out with a party to settle in a far and magical land. And Summerlad is with this party. And then trouble begins. So this is a very slow burn in my opinion, so don't expect to go in here and have a Viking action-packed story, because that's not it. This is more about the friendship between these two boys, men later on, and how far you need to go to stay loyal to a friend that is clearly not a good person. I really enjoyed this. This is again very Juliette Merlier-like. This is fairy tale-esque feeling. The magic system is very nature-based, which is also the case in all of her other books. But differently than the other books, you follow a male protagonist here. And I don't really think that any of her other books do that. Most of all, you follow very strong women. And then the last book that I want to talk about is actually a standalone that I DNF'd. And that is The Priory of the Orange Tree by Samantha Shannon. So normally I don't DNF books, but this one I made an exception. I'm not saying that I will never pick it up again, because to be honest, I didn't really give it a fair shot, but I just wasn't feeling it. I think I got around to, I still have my bookmark, page 65, so it's a little bit sad that I DNF'd that early, but okay. This one had a little bit the same problems that I had with The Mad Ship, no, not The Mad Ship, Ship of Magic by Robin Hobb, so the first one in the Liveship Traders, where you have a multiple POV story set about in different parts of the world. So you're not really invested in the characters early on, you're not really invested in the plot early on, because you don't even know what the plot is. If it's a trilogy and it's the first book, then I just plow through and know that it might pick up afterwards. But this is a standalone, so I'm a little bit thinking, why should I have to work in order to be invested when it's just going to be this one book? So that were all of the books, besides the one that were on my top 10 list, again that I will link down below if you missed it, that I've read in 2020. Thanks for watching, I hope you enjoyed this, and see you later. Bye!